we have the conversation frequently that do downloads matter? And people will say, no, they don't matter. And other people say they do matter. And my perspective is that they do matter from an advertising perspective. If you don't have a large enough audience, you really can't monetize your show.
Podcast Junkies, episode 238. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran, the show where we talk to amazing folks in the podcasting space, people I've been friends with, people I've just gotten to know for the very first time. They all have one thing in common. They have amazing stories in the world of podcasting. Last week's show was great. We had Ariel Niesenblatt on, longtime friend, founder of the Earbuds newsletter, community manager at Squadcast. Really great conversation, geeking out on podcasting and what she's doing in the world of podcasting. And a really great story of how she just took her passion and ran with it. And you'll hear a lot. If you haven't heard that episode already, check it out, episode 237. This week, another friend of ours and mine is on the show, Heather Osgood. She's the founder of True Native Media and the host of the Podcast Advertising Playbook. Heather's got a ton of experience in the industry. She joins us this episode to share her experience working in advertising and how she transitioned to the podcast industry. Because of her expertise, she's able to help us understand how brands and businesses are leveraging podcast advertising to achieve their goals. Naturally, we've got a lot of best practices for monetizing a podcast. And we find out what prompted her to start her own podcast, the Podcast Advertising Playbook. We talk about her journey as a host, what's exciting her about the industry, and what is keeping her motivated with so much attention being focused on podcasting lately. It's a really fascinating conversation. As always, full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/238. If you enjoyed this episode or past episodes, I'd love it if you leave a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. This episode is brought to you by Focusrite and specifically the Scarlett 2i2 sound card, one of my favorite go-to sound cards, something I use for each and every podcast recording. The 3G line is a go-to for all new podcasters. Find out more at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite, and the link will be in the show notes as well. Make sure you stay to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. But for now, let's dig into all things podcast advertising with Heather. So Heather Osgood, founder of True Native Media, thank you so much for joining us on Podcast Junkies.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and chat with you today.
So, man, Heather, how long have we known each other now?
It's been several years, actually. I feel like time has been flying, right?
It feels like podcast bingo or something. We're like, were you at this event? So I started the show after going to New Media Expo in January 2014. That's where I got the idea. I saw Cliff Ravenscraft speak. I saw Pat Flynn speak, and because I took a selfie with Pat, which is funny. And then I saw Amy Porterfield speak and Scott Stratton. So that sort of timestamps it. So where were you timeline-wise in your podcasting journey?
Yeah, so in 2014, I was not even on the radar. I don't even know if I was listening to podcasts in 2014. Okay. Right. Maybe that was the year I started, but I started the company in January of 2016.
Okay.
And then I think you and I met in 2017.
Okay. All right.
So, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what got you into it? So let's talk a little bit about your background and then talk a bit about what True Native does.
Yeah, for sure. So I started my career actually in radio ad sales. So I did radio ad sales, I did newspaper ad sales, and then I started a trade show production company, which is essentially just advertising in person. And then I had that company for about 10 years and I sold that business. And after I sold that company, I didn't have anything to do kind of for my adult. It was the first time in my adult life that I had extra time on my hands. And one day my husband said, "Have you ever listened to a podcast?" And I was like, "No, I would never listen to a podcast. They're so difficult to download and all this." And he said, no, you've got this app on your phone. You should try it. And I was like, oh, I should. So I started listening to podcasts and I got totally obsessed. And then the more I listened, the more I thought, gosh, there's all these really great podcasts that don't have ads on them. And that seems strange to me. So I could tell that like the really successful kind of corporate type podcasts all had ads on them, but it felt like all the independent shows that I really liked didn't have any ads. So I started looking into the industry and I found that, of course, there were companies that were well established to service like the top 1% of podcast, but there wasn't anybody who was open to working with smaller shows. And my thought was, well, gosh, if you've got 10,000 downloads, we can definitely do something with that. And at the time, you really needed to have about 50,000 downloads per episode. So I founded True Native Media to help that mid-level show monetize their podcast.
Yeah, it was interesting because I remember I was talking to Jessica Kupferman, who we both know, like years ago about this, because I think at the time Midroll was out and, they were making a splash and, everyone was tossing around that 50K number. And I remember talking to her and I'm like, it's not like we need a mid-roll. I think I may have used the term like mini roll, like to talk about like that long tail, the people who are getting, the 1,000 to the 5,000 downloads. And so it's interesting that you saw that as an opportunity early on, because it really feels like at that time, and probably still now, it seems like an underserved community.
It is. It's definitely an underserved community. And now, in January, it'll be 5 years. So, it's been a while that we've been working at this. And I certainly have learned a lot of lessons. And as a representation firm, you only get a small percentage of what it is that you're selling. So, number one, we don't personally create any content beyond just our own podcast. And I have never intended to create content because I felt like there's so many great shows out there. Let's help those shows monetize. But I realize the reason why so many people have their own shows is because you keep a much greater percentage of the ad sales. And so that makes sense why they create so much content. And also I have seen that selling smaller shows isn't as easy or as lucrative as I had hoped that it would be. So our company has definitely pivoted a bit where we are now looking for, I would say, not at, we're still not at 50,000, we're at 10,000 now. But when I started, I was like, hey, if you've got 500 downloads, I'll talk to you, I'll work with you. So things have changed, I would say substantially in the industry, but there still is a place. And I think we have the conversation frequently that do downloads matter? And people will say, no, they don't matter. And other people say they do matter. And my perspective is that they do matter from an advertising perspective. If you don't have a large enough audience, you really can't monetize your show, at least through a service like True Native Media. You can go yourself and try and solicit advertisers if you have, even hundreds of listeners. It just depends on who you're reaching and what you're trying to do and how much money you want for it. But, if you're looking to have a company work with you, you've got to have some minimum download number for it to make sense because they've got to make some money in the equation as well.
So I imagine once people find out what you do, especially when you talk to podcasters, like when I go to podcasting conferences and I tell them, I have a show that interviews other podcasters, they're like, well, I have a show. You should interview me. So I imagine it might be the same thing when you tell people, I help podcasters get ads on shows. And immediately they're just like, okay, here's my show. Go work your magic.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what guidance now, since you've heard that asked so many times, you have for podcasters that are just getting started, even while they're thinking about what their show is going to be about. Because, when we build shows for clients, we're always adamant that they speak to a specific audience. Because I'm already thinking like, okay, is there a way you're going to be able to monetize it down the line, either with your own stuff or with sponsorships?
Yeah, I think that you make a really good point. And I always recommend that people start with the end in mind. So if you're starting a podcast, I think it's really important for you to ask yourself why. Why are you starting it? And if you're starting it just because it's entertainment and you want to do it for yourself, great, go for it. If you're doing it because it's a creative art project and an outlet for you and you're really just passionate about the art of podcasting, that's terrific. But if you're starting it thinking, I want to do this and I want to make money, then you need to figure out how you're actually going to make money, and whether that's the idea that you're going to sell a product that you already have, or whether that's that you are, and so you're using it essentially as a marketing vehicle, or if you're trying to get advertisers, then you have to just decide what path you want to go down. And if you have decided that you're interested in advertising, number one, what I tell people is start your show with that in mind. And so structure your show to have it accommodate advertisers. I think one of the big mistakes that podcasts seem to make that is becoming more and more irritating to me, I guess, is that when you're listening to a show, all of a sudden there's no transition and they hop right into an ad read. And you're like, what's going on? So in my opinion, there should be an ebb and a flow to your content. There should be a natural transition, and there should be lots of natural transitions in your show. But if you're going to have an ad, then you should create a natural transition point for an ad. So I think that that's important. And then the next kind of trick that I like to tell people is start with affiliate advertisements in your show. I think that you could go out today and fill your entire podcast with affiliate ads. Not that you should do that, but you could easily get one or two affiliate ads. And number one, that educates your audience that you're going to have advertisers. Number two, it allows you to see what kind of engagement you have with your audience and how responsive they are. And then number three, it allows you to create a really good story for a paying advertiser where you can say, my show on average, creates this level of conversion. And that's what you could expect as well. So I think that that's a really good place for beginning podcasters to start, is at that affiliate level with the intention that they're going to actively grow their audience. And then once they've actively grown their audience, then they're in a place to say, hey, hand me some money to run an ad on my podcast.
And it seems like I always think about reverse engineering this, because if you think about, okay, which affiliates would you want to look at? And obviously you'd want to look at someone that has high payout, right? Or high percentage. And so if you think about, okay, let's say it's medical devices, because sometimes maybe those types of things, anything in the medical or wellness realm sometimes has, like the chili pad, I think it's like $1,000. And so people who are like biohacking. So I would think, okay, you would create a podcast where you're pretty confident that people who use that service or that product would likely be listening to that content. So I think it behooves new podcasters. They always say when you think you've gone niche, go one level more and then go even more niche, because then you're speaking to that intended audience. The other thing I do, which is probably somewhat related, is for my clients, when we help them build show, they're more business owners. So I say, just do an ad read for your own product at the beginning of the show. Like, let listeners know from day one that you have an ad spot that's there, and even if it's your own stuff in the beginning, because I think regular listeners come for the content, but if they're a business owner, they're thinking, they keep hearing that ad spot, and they're like, well, I listen to the show, so, and I have a business, so maybe I should, because I've had that feeling too. Like, oh, I listen to the show and it's got an ad spot. Maybe I should advertise my stuff on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a really good idea. So what you're saying, and I know you're so good at this, but you're saying, take a look at those affiliates that are going to pay out, big, and then almost reverse engineer your podcast to hit that demographic so that you then can, make money from that, essentially.
Yeah, I think about it that way, so you're setting yourself for success, because to your point, if you want to see conversions, it'll also drive the content. Like if you really, really thought about it and you're like, well, I want to create something, I want to create the most valuable show for this type of audience that uses this type of product, in order to have the best result. I don't know if you've seen the movie Joy.
I have.
Have
I? I don't think so.
It's about, I always forget the actress's name, Jennifer something. But it was about the woman who
mop.
found the mop.
Yes, I loved that movie. Yes.
I was surprised at how inspiring that movie was. And the reason I mentioned it here is because I thought it was fascinating. Obviously, this was early days of QVC, right? When it's popular. But as you were talking about this idea with the products, I thought about someone creating like a QVC type podcast where all they have are affiliates on there. So you had it's almost like the audio QVC version, and you're just mentioning products the whole podcast, which I thought was funny.
I think you could totally do that. I mean, we're coming up on the holidays right now, and I think, holidays in 2020 are going to be a little different than they've been before. And I feel like if you could create a podcast that was just like a holiday podcast, and for the next, for October and November, maybe you have an episode a day where you highlight a company, or I don't know, you could come up with so many creative ideas because people want creative. I mean, they're going to want creative Christmas ideas, right? So I think that this is a great idea. Somebody could launch it at the holidays and see how it goes and then morph it.
As podcasters, we never have a shortage of podcast ideas. So if I haven't done it by the time this goes live, you're welcome, listener, to borrow this idea.
Yes.
So you started your own show as well. So talk about a little bit your thought process as a business owner online, and obviously with so many of your clients producing amazing shows, you have no shortage of inspiration. So talk to me about how you thought about starting the podcast for True Native.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so the concept behind our podcast, it's called the Podcast Advertising Playbook, is to really create a show that highlights podcast advertising. So what are all the ins and outs? How do you get ads on your show? If you're an advertiser, how do you make ads successful? And so we've had an opportunity to interview several people in the industry who have had success. So originally I started the show wanting to just interview as many brands as possible that had had success in podcast advertising. I fairly quickly found out that a lot of people don't want to share their secrets. And so it wasn't as easy to get some brands on as I had hoped, because they were like, I don't want to come on and tell you my secret sauce. But so we do have a handful of interviews that have been really great. And then just recently been branching out and interviewing some really interesting people who are kind of supporting the ad space in podcasting, which is fun. So we've got some of those that are going to be coming out here in the next month or so. But really the concept is that there are so many facets to advertising in podcasting. And one of the things that's so fascinating about this industry is that things change so quickly. And with that change, you sometimes, especially if you're a podcaster, may not always know exactly where the industry is at. So the show is designed to help bring new concepts to both podcasters and advertisers and help them understand the podcast ad space.
Can you mention some of those companies that are supporting the ad space?
Yeah. So one of the interviews that I just had was Brian Barletta. He just started Sounds Profitable, a newsletter that's an offshoot of Pod News.
Oh, that's right. I did see that.
Yeah. And he's in the ad tech space. So he had originally come from Barometric, which is a podcast attribution software company, and then was at Megaphone, and then now is out on his own. And he's got a lot of passion for the space, and, is really looking at how is ad tech playing a role in the industry. And I think there's a big question right now between the host read ad is so valuable, and it's, I would say, in my opinion, one of the biggest differentiators between podcast ads and every other type of advertising out there. And so there's that piece, but then there's the other piece of, gosh, isn't automation nice? Aren't pre-recorded ads nice? I'm just going to sit back as a podcaster and let the money roll in. So you have people like Anchor that are, I would say, making a play for that, trying to get more people on their platform so they can then programmatically sell ads onto their show, which is nice from one perspective. And there's more programmatic ad buying happening in this space than there have been before. So it's, I think, looking at that ad tech and saying, how is that going to impact the space? But also what I appreciate about Brian is that he has this concept about how can we also preserve the value of the host-read ad, and how could we preserve the value of the host-read ad and use the ad tech to kind of infuse the two, which is certainly a very important position that I feel like I've taken. How do we take the host-read ad and use the dynamic insertion capability to maximize our reach, maximize our income, but also preserve the value that the industry brings? So that's an interview that's going to be coming up. And then there's another company called LaunchPod Media. A gentleman named Johnny Dinkle founded that. And he's got a really interesting take on understanding audience analytics and does a lot of, I would say, very hands-on research on podcasts. And that episode that I did with him, I'm just so excited for it to come out because he gave so many great tips about how to analyze your audience and tips that I've never heard. He's one of those kind of boy genius type people where he had a podcast himself and he was like, I want to understand my audience better. How do I do that? And since my hosting provider is not giving me that information, how can I take other techniques to analyze my audience? And then his company has come from that. So it's kind of,
What was his name again?
His name is Johnny Dinkle.
Okay.
So he's pretty active on LinkedIn.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you must love the ability to geek out podcast ad tech and you know, when you're going down those rabbit holes in a specific genre, which is your business, is something you're passionate about, and you find someone that's just as passionate about it. Those tend to be fun conversations, I would imagine.
Yeah, they are. And what I find is a little bit funny is that I definitely wouldn't classify myself as a real techie type person, but I've learned so much, and it's just, to me, it's just so exciting because the heart and soul of podcasting is this ability for anybody to go out there and have a voice and create a show, but not only create it, but to make money. And, so I really just love that the industry is growing and maturing, and it's fun to have. I feel like it's fun to be in an industry that feels really collaborative. I know it's not always collaborative. Of course, there are still companies that are competitive, but by and large, I feel like it's a really collaborative space, which is so fun to be part of.
Where are you getting your news from? Like, how are you keeping your finger on the pulse with what's happening? Obviously, Pod News is a big source of that for me, just because I used to subscribe to a lot of the newsletters, but then it's like they were just repeating stuff, and I was just like, how do you curate it? And I think that's what James does a good job of with Pod News. I'm wondering if you had any other sources that you like.
I have to say Pod News is my favorite. And I agree with you. I feel like I used to subscribe to several others, and I still do. But really, I feel like Pod News is the one that I turn to the most. What I like about Pod News is that I feel like he covers independent issues just as well as he covers more corporate items.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I really like that. I also subscribe to Hot Pod, and I like that as well. But I feel like he does tend to, it feels like he's more corporate. When I don't know, when I read his stuff, it just feels more like he's focused on the industry from a corporate level as opposed to an independent podcaster level. But I feel like, those two sources.
Yeah, what some folks call the procasters.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he's definitely more procaster.
Yeah.
And then truthfully, I feel like we've gotten really active on LinkedIn, and I love LinkedIn. And I feel like there are a lot of things that come out of that as well, because you can connect with people. Everybody's starting a business in podcasting right now, it feels like. But it could be part of that, that reticular activating system that when you've got your finger on the pulse, you just see it everywhere. But it feels like everybody.
When you're driving a Volkswagen Beetle, everyone seems to have a Volkswagen
Exactly,
Beetle.
yeah. So I don't know, maybe that's I just see podcasts everywhere because that's what I'm looking for. But yeah,
it is interesting because if you use James's newsletter as a finger on the pulse, then he mentions new companies, and it feels like there was a week when I felt like he was mentioning at least one or two new companies, like on every single newsletter. I was like, I couldn't keep up, and I tracked them for a project I'm working on. So it's interesting because it stands out, like this company's doing this, and this network's doing this, and this company's doing this, and I think, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are, the impact of the Joe Rogan $100 million to Spotify contract, and this. Regardless of whether you like the guy or like the content or not, I think podcasting wise, it's really interesting for the industry.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting. And I think what is even equally fascinating is watching people's reactions to it, because people seem like they have really, very, I think, kind of polarizing takes on it, whether it's a positive or a negative. Some people have said, well, if the show is only going to be on Spotify, then that means it's actually not even a podcast because it's not on all these other channels. And the very definition of a podcast is to be on all these other channels, right?
And I feel that argument as that ship has already sailed.
Yeah.
Like it feels, I think about those two characters in the Muppets who were the older guys in the balcony sometimes. And sometimes when I hear these arguments, certain personalities, come to mind like, hey, this is not how back in the day, how we would do things. It's like you can't. I think the industry has to innovate, and what we think is a podcast. I know there's YouTubers that have podcasts, but there's no RSS feed. It's just like on YouTube. So I think to your point, we should just consider them shows. Like you have a show, and it's just, and then these are just different distribution channels. I think helps people open it up to see what the possibilities are.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I totally agree. And I don't think, in my opinion, you can look at it and see it as anything but positive. I mean, the fact that you have this guy, granted, he was a comedian and UFC announcer, actor, all those things.
Fear Factor
yeah,
guy.
Right. Fear Factor. So, I mean, it's not like he, just stepped off the prairie and started a podcast or something, right? I mean, this guy had like some connections, but I think that watching him grow his show and seeing, number one, how much he's been able to make, even just in ad revenue alone on his podcast. And then the fact that it's being, acquired. And, oh, by the way, he's going to be interviewing, at least I heard he was interviewing President Trump. So, I mean.
Yeah, that was the latest. Yeah, that Trump, Trump said he would debate Joe Biden. I said on Twitter, so there's nothing official, and I doubt, I can't imagine the Biden campaign agreeing to that, because it would be the most funniest thing to watch and moment in time of U.S. history. I think anyone could ever imagine.
It would be crazy.
So, ratings-wise, it would be pretty bananas.
But I mean, to me, it's like, that's all, it's pretty cool, right? To say like this guy started from, you can't say he started from nothing, but he started a podcast and took it to something pretty huge.
Yeah.
And so I think that to me, that's a positive. One of the things that I keep throwing around that I don't have an answer for is whether or not a channel like Spotify or Anchor is trying to make a play to become like a YouTube of podcasting. And I think that worries me a little bit. I really like the independent, open source nature of podcasting right now. And I like it. It's also a challenge because it doesn't feel like there's a ton of standardization in the industry, especially when it comes from an ad perspective. It's like, oh, well, this hosting provider does this and it's like that, and not a hosting provider does that. And, but it does, I hope that we're not going down that path where these large companies are coming into the space, which lots of large companies are. We just heard Amazon a few weeks ago is coming out into the space. So it worries me a little bit that we're going to have like one dominant player, and I don't really want that personally, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, it's interesting because it feels like sometimes it might in some ways mimic the cable model. So now you have like before everyone was trying to unbundle because, the days of paying $170 a month for like 3 channels, even though you get like 150 that nobody watches, has gone by the wayside. And I think on the podcasting side, it feels like there may be shows that are only available on Spotify, like Joe Rogan is. I think Apple is making a play to produce their own shows as well. So there'll be some of that, I think, and it'll obviously be harder to reach. But also folks like Adam Curry, I don't know if you saw his new initiative where he's trying to create that open source directory where it's essentially the equivalent of what the functionality that Apple provides, but it's open source and it's going to remain open source. And I think they've built it in a way where no one can actually like claim ownership for it. I know that James of Pod News has mentioned that he's made that the prominent directory when people search, that's the place he wants them to search first. So, there is some pushback on what you're talking about. So I think everyone is interested in the openness of it, and that's what makes it so approachable for people as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely.
Talk to me a little bit about the what you went through as being the host of a podcast, because you said it's something that you hadn't done before, and talk to me from where you were when you started and what some of your challenges and or fears were of being a host and interviewing people, and then how you've grown to current time with because of the reps and because of the interviews.
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually, before I launched True Native Media, I launched a podcast called Leap to Grow. And I want to say I probably produced like 15 episodes because I knew I wanted to be part of the podcast space. And so I thought, I'll start a podcast, but I really had my sight set on founding the agency, but it felt like kind of a daunting task. And so I started the podcast, and the more I did that podcast, the more I thought, really what I want to do is the agency. Like that's where my heart is. So I stopped the Leap to Grow podcast. And then after I started the agency, probably, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 months in, I started a podcast called The Business of Podcasting. And actually had Jessica Kupferman was on that with me for a little while, and another co-host, Ray Palermo, who's now at Megaphone.
Oh, yeah.
And we did, do you know Ray?
I know Ray.
Oh, yeah, you know Ray. But yeah, so we did that together for a little while, which was really fun. And then it kind of faded because we got busy. And then I hired a marketing person about 1.5 years ago. And she was like, okay, Heather, we have to do this. Like, you have to get on this. And so I started doing it. And truthfully, I started it pretty sporadically. I always feel, and you probably feel the same way because I'm out there giving everyone advice on how they should podcast, that I'm always like, I need to up my podcast game because
of course,
I'm not producing my episodes consistently and all that. But so we have, I would say probably in the last, since January, we have more consistently produced episodes, but in the last 3-4 months, we have had an episode come out every single week. And I think number one, I really wanted a guest for every episode, and that was kind of slowing me up. And then at one point I thought, you know what? I don't need a guest for every show. And so now it's a hybrid between just solo shows where I just talk about something that I see happening in the industry and me interviewing people. And I feel like that has given me a lot of that freedom and flexibility to feel like it's okay not to have to, have somebody there all the time. And we did just also, I started doing it on video a couple of months ago. So now I'm doing video and audio, which I feel like is a big step up for me. My goal when I podcast is to record and say as few filler words as possible and make as few mistakes as possible so that the editing is almost not there. So I try really hard to do that. So I've found that if I can script out the show, that's helpful for me, but I don't usually write everything. I just write bullets and then I talk off of that. And I think that has helped me, and also producing a lot of LinkedIn videos has helped me get better at that. And then I think those skills have kind of translated into being better or more comfortable interviewing people. I don't think that I have interviewing down to a science for sure, because I have only done a handful of them so far, but I don't know, probably 10. But I do feel like interviewing is a skill, and it's something that I would like to focus more energy on learning how to interview well.
Yeah. So with this show being an interview-based show, it's been something that I've been consciously aware of as I listen to other shows. And Jordan Harbinger does a really good job of interviewing. He's been on a couple of times, and he talks about the 4 to 6 hours of prep that he does. And he has a different type of guest as well, that are pretty well known. I think he just had Mark Cuban on recently. And so he gets good names. But I think it depends on, it's how much you want to learn or educate your listeners about the interviewee is probably something to take into account. But sometimes it's also your natural curiosity. And I think the fact that you're learning from these folks as you conduct the interview leads you to ask questions that are helpful for your audience as well. Because sometimes when I have people that are doing something really, really positive, but I don't know a ton about them, I feel that if I'm naturally curious and ask those types of questions, then at least I'm doing something good for my listeners as well. I'm wondering if you felt that also.
Absolutely. I think that I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think as an interviewer, it's important to have a script of questions. And I've got an interview scheduled tomorrow, and she's the first person who's ever asked me to send her a list of all the questions before the interview. And I understand, she works for a company. She has to, preserve the integrity or reputation of the company. And she probably doesn't want me to spring something on her that she wouldn't be comfortable answering. But so of course I have a list of questions that I'm trying to get answered in the interview, but I dislike interviews that are so scripted that it's like the person asks a question. Oh, they answer next question. They answer next question, right? It just doesn't feel
Don't forget the
fun
lightning
to
round.
listen to. And so
as soon as you hear that, you're just like, you like cringe a little. Your favorite ice cream, if you're a spirit animal, like those types of questions.
I know. And I have to say, having been interviewed on more podcasts than I've interviewed, I hate those questions. Like, who is your favorite business owner? I don't know who my favorite business owner is or whatever. Yeah. Anyways, but I think the best interviews are one where you say, like, the host has a natural curiosity about the guest, and as a listener, you have that curiosity as well. And you're right there along with the host saying, ask that question. Exactly. Oh, I want to find out more about that. Dig in deeper, So I think if you can navigate through an interview that way, that's
because the listener is doing that. And I always tell folks, like, there's three people in a podcast conversation: the host, the guest, and the listener. And if you say something like, I've listened to shows and I'm like, oh man, I hope they ask that follow-up question, because she just opened up a thread there, and I'm just like, please go down that rabbit hole. And so I think keeping that in mind is helpful. I'm wondering, what is exciting for you and what keeps you motivated? Because this is, being an entrepreneur, number one, is super challenging. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone who started a business. And then also trying to understand whether you're in the right industry for your skill set as well, because it keeps changing and you're like, okay, do I grow with it? And do I keep learning? Or do I figure out, like, it's time for me to do something else? So I'm wondering how you weigh all those in your business owner journey in this industry.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was doing my trade show production company, I had a business partner who was also my best friend. And I remember during that journey looking at her and thinking, I would never want to do anything else ever in my life. This is perfect in every way. And I love it inside and out, because I loved it so much. But then there came a point where all of a sudden I woke up one day and I was like, I'm done. And it was like this really weird realization, like I just am ready to move on to the next chapter in my life. And I think it's so bizarre because I never intended that to be the case. So one of the lessons that I learned in that business was, and one of the things that I say constantly that I've already said is, you should begin your podcast with the end in mind, but you should also begin any business with the end in mind. And the mistake I made with my last company was not beginning with the end in mind. So when that moment came to say, like, okay, I'm ready to leave, we didn't have a plan for that. And it was really hard to leave. So now, as I have started True Native Media, I have started it with the intention of a specific trajectory that I'm growing the business toward. But what motivates me most in every facet of my life is, people are just so important. And I try to go back every day and just think about relationships, right? Think about the relationships that I have with my podcasters, and I try to visualize them and their families and what they're trying to build and create, and what it looks like for them to have really great ad campaigns and how that's going to support them. Then I think about my employees and what it looks like for them to be building something, and for us all to work together collaboratively. There we go. To build this great business. And also the advertisers, what are they getting out of this? And how are we helping their businesses grow? And how are we helping their customers grow? So for me, it's just the interconnectedness of what I believe, everything in this world is so interconnected when it comes to, a person to person. And that's what all business should be, in my opinion, is that connection from person to person. And what I love about podcasting is that for me personally, I literally started listening to audiobooks in my early 20s and was obsessed with them. And I'm just an audio person. I love it. So I feel like for me, podcasting fills so many of the holes in my life. And I feel like has helped me, challenge me to push myself and help contribute to the industry and help contribute to podcasts. And I feel like that's what makes me so inspired and excited.
That's awesome.
Get up every morning.
Awesome and incredibly inspiring. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, sometimes in your day to day, you forget about like why or how you ended up in this business. And then I remember, but then as you were speaking, I was thinking about those first few podcasts that I discovered, and I think it was pretty magical at the time because I was just like, wow, this is so interesting. I didn't even know this existed. I listened to a podcast called The Memory Palace, and he was just like it was just like a really fascinating, kind of like 99% Invisible. I don't know if you've ever heard that one. That sort of vibe where they tell a story, but it's like a theater of the mind thing. And then I was learning stuff as well because I was learning how to build mobile apps. And this was probably 2013. And I think like Pat Flynn's early days of his podcast. So I think it just, sometimes we forget to remind ourselves of why we're doing what we're doing. And I think what you just laid out was something that's was helpful for a reminder for that.
Great. Yeah, I agree. It's important to remember because it's so easy to get caught up in the minutia of life. And I think maybe it's the older I get too, the more I'm like, wait, what is my purpose? What am I doing here? And just trying to be really conscientious of that helps.
I turn 50 next month. So
in every way.
It's something.
Congratulations.
So
I haven't hit that plateau yet.
If ever there was a milestone that made you think about like first half, second half of your life, like that's definitely the one. So yeah.
Yep.
I've been giving that some thought. So a couple questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Something I have changed my mind about recently. What a good question. I would say that I have probably, just the way that I'm viewing my company. So we're a remote company. We've always been remote. And I like that. But I feel like it's been such an interesting transition as we've, been in this pandemic, everybody working independently. And I think that I had been feeling like a remote company was a little easier than having an in-person company. And I think that what has contributed to the difficulty of a remote company is that when one aspect of your life is kind of separate from other things, it feels easy. But when you're confined in other ways, I think it becomes more challenging. So I'm just finding that creating community and connection between my staff is more challenging than I thought it would be. And I feel like as we have grown as a company, it has become more apparent that it's harder to get, it's easy to get 2 or 3 people connected. It's harder to get 5 or 6 people connected, So I think that in terms of, I haven't changed my mind necessarily to say I'm not interested in a remote company anymore. I still am, but I have changed my mind in how I'm approaching the creation of that remote company and team, and really just looking at it in a different way of how can we spend more time just on that person, I guess getting back to what I was talking about before, on that personal level of how do we really have a connection?
You spend a lot of your time during the day and during the week with these people. And, like even back when I was in my corporate job, and if I thought about how many hours I spent in the office relative to like time at home, like you literally spend a good portion of your waking hours with working with the people that are helping you build your business. So yeah, it'll be interesting how it plays out, obviously, because there's some choices that are being made for us right now, depending on where in the country or where in the world you are. So it was the forced experiment that a lot of people weren't prepared for. But now when you see what's happening with like no one racing back to New York City to like get crammed into like these offices, and I think it's at 10% and occupancy right now. It's no one's going back.
Really?
People that don't have to go back are not going back. Companies that had small offices. I spoke with Dave from Chartable, and he talked about how they had an office, and they probably weren't going to be going to renew the lease back in New York City because, why do you need that space? If it's something that's not adding value. So it's interesting, to your point about like what the current work environment looks like, but also what it's going to look like in the future. So it'll be interesting for people who are in that space. I'll tell you that much. Corporate real estate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that to me, one of the biggest concerns I have is just human interaction. I mean, we need people. And so what does that look like? And how is that going to progress? Should be interesting.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
The most misunderstood thing about me, I would say that as an entrepreneur, I'm extremely driven and extremely ambitious. And I think that as a woman, I feel that has been a part of me throughout my life that has been kind of misunderstood. I think often, and I'm so thankful for the Me Too movement, and I'm just thankful for so many of the things. A lot of the social awakenings that I feel like we're going through right now have been really powerful, but it's easy as a woman to feel discounted a bit. And that to me has been a challenge over the years, but it feels good that on a lot of levels now it's okay for me to be an ambitious woman. I think it hasn't always necessarily felt very acceptable to be driven and ambitious and be a woman. So I'm happy, but I feel like that has been, growing up in my life, that has been something that.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. And I'm glad that we're in an environment where communities and folks that, were on the sidelines and not getting, their due time in the spotlight because of, the patriarchy, to be honest, to give you the short version of it. But I think it's refreshing. And especially with a younger generation who think that that's how it should have been. It's supposed to be that way anyway. Like if you talk to younger kids and you if they have a gay friend or someone makes an offhand comment, it's usually the child that's like correcting you, be like, no, you can't say that word anymore or something like that. So that's comforting and reassuring as well. And I'm wondering if you see that also with your kids or with a younger generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that it's neat that we are able to live in a time where I feel like history is being made, because I think social change has happened much quicker right now than it has in the past. And I think that has a lot to do with technology, obviously. And that is a whole different conversation we could have, of course, about the role that technology has played in all of this. But I think it certainly has benefited the progression of just social change in general. And I think absolutely, having kids myself and seeing the way that they act and seeing how society is molding and shaping them right now is definitely different than when I was a kid. And so I'm excited to see a lot of the changes that are happening. Yeah.
Regarding technology, have you watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix yet?
I watched the other night, I watched like half of it. I didn't watch all of it, but it's hard to watch. And then of course, coming from an advertising perspective and like we track people and, just do stuff like that. It's just, trying to make peace with all of that is interesting, but it's I want to finish watching it. It was really good.
Yeah. Yeah. And then The Great Hack is the other one, which is like the partner to that just came out early.
Oh, I haven't.
A couple months ago. It's about the Cambridge Analytica scandal and how they basically hacked Facebook. Not really hacked it; they just used it,
right?
And they used it for to influence elections, which is wild. So watching those two back to back is pretty unnerving, but I think it's also helpful to be educated about. Then you can make your own decisions at the end of the movie and decide what you want to do and how you want to adjust your life.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, like all of these conversations, especially with friends that I've known now for years and because of podcasting, never know where these are going to go, but I'm grateful for the opportunity because now when I talk to friends, it's more like Heather and I never get to catch up. So let me just invite her on the show and then we can catch up there.
Totally true.
So I'm usually kind of like selfishly sometimes just have an hour uninterrupted because it's hard to get into an uninterrupted hour to catch up with friends. So I'm just like, who are my podcasting friends that I just want to talk to for an hour?
Well, thanks for having me, Harry, because it's been great talking with you for an hour.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your friendship, your guidance on all things podcasting. It's been helpful to have a fellow business owner to talk shop with sometimes because, as you know, sometimes this can be a lonely journey.
Yes.
So I appreciate having you as a friend for all these years.
Yeah, I appreciate your friendship too. And thanks for having me on this show. It's been great chatting.
Yeah. So for folks want to learn more about True Native and to connect with you online, what's the best way?
So you can go to truenativemedia.com and find out information whether you're an advertiser or a podcaster and you want to learn more. You can go there and all that information is there. I'm really active on LinkedIn. So if you're interested in engaging with me there, you can go to, just LinkedIn and look for Heather Osgood. And then lastly, we actually just launched a course a few months ago called the Podcast Moneymaker Course, where we teach people how to grow their show and monetize it through advertising. So essentially, if your show is too small for representation, that's a good place for you to go, where I can just walk you through how we do it essentially, and you can do it for yourself. And you can find that at heatherosgood.com.
Awesome. And we'll sync up and make sure I have all those resources listed in the show notes as well.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Harry.
Thanks again. Thanks to Heather for coming on the show. Always nice when I get to connect with friends. And now, in lieu of the live events that are on hold for the foreseeable future, I relish every moment to spend time with my podcasting peeps. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/238. We mentioned a lot of resources in this one, so make sure you check that out. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Special thanks to our ongoing podcast sponsor, the wonderful team at Focusrite and their awesome line of gear, specifically the Scarlett 2i 2 Pro, one of my favorites, the 3G third generation. Get more details at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Sign up for a free podcast brainstorm at fullcast.co/chat15 to see how we can help you with the launch of your show. Tune in next week for my conversation with Ronsley Vaz, founder of the We Are Podcast Conference in Australia, which I was honored enough to be invited to and attend a couple of years ago. Ronzi is a friend from a business mastermind we're a part of as well called Black Belt. And we've got a really, really interesting, heartfelt story from Ronsley. The things that he's gone through and the challenges he's had to overcome to get where he's at in the world of podcasting is really, really inspiring. I'm excited to bring that one to you next week. If you made it this far, no doubt you're looking for this week's retention hashtag. Let's go with Ads by Heather. ADSBY Heather. Hashtag Ads by Heather. You can tag us at podcast_junkies and Heather at HMOSGOOD. That's HM Osgood. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Talk to you next week.